What is going on, you guys, and welcome back to this series. In this video, we are going to be installing the radium surge tank system, which is going to be my solution for being able to increase fuel pressure at a 1-to-1 rate as we begin to get on boost when the supercharger gets installed. This is a pretty important modification to do to make sure that the car runs right, especially if you're going to be running at a higher boost pressure. I do want to take just a moment to quickly cover with you guys what exactly a fuel return system is and why it's important when you're planning on installing a supercharger or a turbocharger in your car. I will be doing a separate video to cover it in a little bit more detail after this entire install series, but let me briefly talk to you guys about what a return style fuel system is and what it does. Now here is a rough diagram of what a fuel return system is going to look like. The factory system is shown here in black. We're going to have the fuel tank itself, and then a fuel pump in here is going to pump fuel up and over to our fuel rails and to our injectors, and this whole thing sits underneath the intake manifold. We saw that in our previous video when we were changing out the injectors. Now with a fuel return system, we're going to integrate an aftermarket fuel pressure regulator. What a fuel pressure regulator does is it maintains a constant pressure inside of our fuel rails and for the injectors by allowing a certain amount of fuel to be able to flow back into the fuel tank. That way, any of the unused fuel when you're not under load, for instance, is not continuing to raise the pressure of the injectors, but rather it's allowed to just go back into the tank. This is really important to do whenever you're upgrading your fuel pump, because the larger fuel pumps are going to be wanting to flow a lot more fuel through the system. They traditionally have a constant amount of flow, so you need to be able to send all that excess fuel that you're not using when you're, for instance, at idle back into the tank, or otherwise you're going to have large fuel pressure spikes within your fuel injectors. Now what's really important for forced induction cars is being able to raise this pressure dynamically as we begin to get on boost. So we use a boost reference here which attaches to the intake manifold, and then it's allowed to actually raise the pressure within the fuel rails at a rate of 1-to-1, so an increase of 1 psi in fuel pressure with an increase of 1 psi of boost within the intake manifold. The reason why this is important, if we look at the diagrams over here on the right side, so if we are running the car normally, it's going to sit at about 52 psi, and if we're not under boost, we're going to be at about 0 psi pressure. This is what the original injectors were intended to operate at. And at this pressure difference across the injectors, we get good fuel atomization. The little droplets that we get out of those fuel injectors are really fine, and so that's going to burn really well within the combustion chamber. Now, if we don't raise our fuel pressure, if we stay at a constant 52 psi, but our intake manifold pressure goes up to, let's say, about 14 psi, which is what I intend to run on my car, it's possible that the fuel injectors aren't going to be able to operate as efficiently. The fuel is not going to get as well atomized. It's not going to be a really good spray, but instead the droplets are going to get a little bit clumpy. To be able to demonstrate this better, we can use, for instance, like a little water sprayer here. Now if I press on this trigger really hard and put a lot of pressure on it, we can see that the droplets come out in a really nice spray. It's really fine. But if we don't put a lot of pressure on it, if we only lightly squeeze the trigger here, we can see that the droplets begin to clump up. So in order to be able to get around this problem, we don't want to have a constant fuel pressure of 52 psi, which is how the car originally was designed to operate, but instead we want to try and be able to increase this fuel pressure at the same rate that our intake manifold pressure is increasing. So we're going to add 14 psi to that 52 to make it maybe about 66. And that pressure is going to be dynamic as well. So if you're making 2 pounds of boost, you'll be at 54 psi, for instance. The pressure regulator here is going to get that based off of that boost reference line, which we're going to install here in today's video. Do you actually need a return style fuel system whenever you're going to run a supercharger or a turbocharger? Not necessarily. You can still get around this problem through tuning. You can basically run the duty cycle of the injectors a little bit longer to spit more fuel into the engine, but it means the car's not going to be running as efficiently. It's going to be running a little bit hotter. Your risk of detonation is also going to be a bit higher, so overall the car is just not going to be able to run as well. And also I want to point out that the higher this pressure, the more important it is to run a return style fuel system. So if you're going to be running high boost like myself at about 14 psi, it gets more and more important to install this system. When you have smaller pressures, 6, 7 psi, it may not be as big of an issue, but generally you want to install a system like this to be able to get the car to run efficiently. Alright guys, now let's talk about the radium system. The radium system revolves primarily around what they call their surge tank. The surge tank is a little 1-liter fuel capacitor which houses 2 fuel pumps that send fuel over to the engine. This surge tank sits behind the driver's side where the factory sending unit used to be, and it's actually fed fuel from the original fuel pump location. That Aeromotive 3 40-liter power fuel pump that we installed in the last video is going to be sending fuel over to this to be able to keep this little surge tank topped off, in conjunction with a little check valve that they have on the bottom of this tank to be able to siphon fuel off of the driver's side of the saddle tank. The whole idea behind the surge tank system is the mitigation of fuel starvation, which the 370Z is sometimes known to have problems with. You see, whenever you're in a track setting and you're running low on fuel, and you take a quarter really hard, it's possible for that fuel level to get sloshed over to one side, and then the factory pump location ends up just sucking up a ton of air, which gets into the fuel lines and can possibly cause the engine to die down. By integrating additional pumps within this tank and keeping this tank constantly topped off with fuel, you're never going to run into that issue. You see, whenever you're on the straightaways or you're drag racing, you're going to be slowly draining fuel out of this tank, but you're not going to be under full throttle all the time. Whenever you're taking a corner and you're not using a ton of gas, the factory pump location is going to be able to continue pumping fuel back into this tank and then keep it topped off in conjunction with the check valve that sits on the bottom of here. The surge tank system also integrates the fuel pressure regulator right on top of the top hat for the surge tank itself. We've got an adjusting knob so we can fine tune our fuel pressure, as well as an inlet to use for the boost reference. That way we can maintain our 1-to-1 fuel pressure increase. This system is a little bit different from a traditional return style fuel system in that you're not going to be running your return hose all the way over to the engine bay. Instead, the return system is kind of built straight into the tank itself. It just bleeds the fuel straight back into the tank column. This system is advantageous in the fact that we're not going to be running a return fuel hose all the way over to the tank, which makes ease of installation a little bit easier. And because we don't have that return fuel line coming back from the engine, we're not going to have warm gasoline being fed back into the tank, which can increase the rate of vaporization within the tank itself. Instead, we're just running the single air hose from the manifold all the way over to our pressure regulator, which will be a little bit easier to route. But there are a couple of disadvantages to this, namely because of the fact that we're sticking a container into the gas tank, the rate at which your gas level is going to fall is going to increase. But it does mean that when you do hit empty, you are going to have a little bit of extra fuel still left in the tank within the surge tank itself. Also, the wiring for this can be a little bit more complicated because you've got a total of 3 fuel pumps, 1 sitting within the factory housing and 2 within the surge tank. It does mean that your wiring is going to be a little bit more complicated, but personally I feel like this system is just going to be a lot nicer to install, and it's also nice that it helps with the fuel starvation issue as well. Now, in addition to the surge tank system, I did also invest in some optional extras, namely some spare fuel hose, which I'm going to use to redo the fuel pump housing in the car. At the end of that install video, I had mentioned that I had a slow pressure bleed off whenever the pump started priming. This was either related to the check valve in the fuel pump, or it was related to the seal for the fuel hoses themselves. So I'm going to go back and redo them with these plastic hoses, which are known to fit a lot tighter, so that should eliminate any issues with leakage through the fuel hoses themselves. And it will mean that I can check to see if it's actually the fuel pump itself. Plus, these fuel hoses are rated for submersion in gasoline in the 85, whereas the fuel lines that I originally used within that fuel tank housing, there was no statement saying if they were rated for fuel submersion or not. That'll just give me some additional peace of mind to ensure that I don't have issues later on down the road. And then I also invested in a check valve because the performance regulators that you'll sometimes buy won't always hold pressure very well within the lines. So after you prime the pump, sometimes it can be difficult to start the car. By integrating a check valve like this, it's going to prevent that fuel from being able to flow backwards through the fuel lines, and it's going to keep that pressure up, making the car a little bit easier to start. So that's pretty much everything that comes with the kit. I mean, you're going to get some additional fuel hose, some wiring and things. We'll get to all of this a little bit later. First things first though, I'm going to pull the factory housing back out, and we're going to install these upgraded fuel lines just to make sure that we don't have any issues with leaking in the fuel lines themselves. So here is our updated fuel pump housing. There were 2 things we were looking for to try and prevent the fuel pressure bleed issue that I was talking about at the end of that fuel pump video. Number 1 was the fittings on the barbs. So I've gone ahead and replaced all the tubing here with the original plastic hose that I was intending to install. And it just sits much tighter on the barb fittings, so I'm a lot less worried about leakage here. This stuff also doesn't kink, so there's no issues with kinking in the hose. The other thing I was concerned about was the fuel pump. Now, instead of continuing to use that Aeromotive pump, I've got an AEM fuel pump now installed in the housing. When I originally reached out to Aeromotive to try and ask them if there was a potential issue with check valves, this is the response that I got back.
Though it's possible the check valve has something obstructing it from closing and sealing, it's not a common or even uncommon issue. This can be difficult to diagnose exactly what's causing the pressure drop, so be aware this can be a rabbit hole down which more than one hot rodder or enthusiast has disappeared. Yeah.
To me, that was kind of a non-answer. They basically told me that they were unsure what it might possibly be. I thought it was just worth trying out a different pump because I had a spare AEM pump laying around. We're gonna see if this one may also allow us to prevent the fuel pressure drop issue that we're seeing. We're gonna install this housing back in the car. We're gonna prime up the pump, and then we're gonna see if we're able to hold pressure. This will also allow us to check to see if we have any leaking injectors as well. So the pump is installed. It's time to check to see if we fixed our fuel bleed issue by priming the pump but not starting the car yet. To do that, we're going to hit start stop twice with the key. And now let's go check the pressure. Alright, so it's the next day now. When I left the garage yesterday, the fuel pressure was sitting at about 46 psi. And if we take a look there, it looks like we are still sitting at roughly maybe 36-ish. So we've only lost about 10 psi over the course of maybe 12 or 13 hours. So this is not bad. This indicates that we have a pretty good seal. You're always going to get some amount of fuel pressure leakage over time. That's just a given, but it's not dropping drastically like I saw when I'd originally installed the pump and the fuel system that I'd put in first. So this is a good sign, and I don't think we're going to have any issues with leaking injectors. Now what we want to go ahead and do is we want to take out most of the interior in the car. We need to do this to be able to get to the fuel sending unit and get a little more access, as well as to be able to run additional wires and things. I've already done a video on taking apart the interior in the 370Z, so I'm just going to be rolling the time lapse here. So here we are inside the car now. Pretty much all the interior is taken up. You don't necessarily have to undo everything like I have, but because I'm going to be running so many wires and a couple of extra hoses, it's just going to make things easier. So now we're going to get to the fuel sending unit. In order to do that, we're going to undo these 4 bolts on this plate here, and there's also going to be an additional 6 bolts that are holding on the cover plate for the sending unit itself. Doing this is going to be pretty much the exact same procedure as taking out the fuel pump, so if you want to reference the bolts and everything, you can check out my fuel pump install video to get an idea of what's involved. So we're going to go ahead and get down to the fuel sending unit. We're going to unplug the harness for it and pull it out of the car, and then we're going to be using some of the sensors on that to be able to install it on a radium unit. And here is the factory sending unit out of the car. The sole purpose of this thing is just to measure the fuel level on the driver's side of the saddle tank. So all we need to do is remove this fuel level sensor because we're going to be reusing it on the radium tank. So we're just going to cut the wires as close to the socket as possible so we have as much slack that we can work with whenever we go to install this on the radium tank. And then this removes the same way as the level sensor for the passenger side and the fuel pump assembly. We're just going to push this one tab in, and then we should be able to slide this entire unit up to be able to remove the sensor, just like that. All right, now let's begin work on the surge tank itself. Now, depending on how you ordered and what you want your setup to be, you may not actually need to open this. You can order these with 1 or 2 pumps already installed. I ordered it with 1 pump installed and 1 pump not installed, so I can open this up and kind of show you guys what you need to do if you want to upgrade to add an additional pump. So in order to get this open, there are a couple of bolts that we can see here on the back side of the surge tank. So we're going to use a little hex bit, and we're going to remove these 2 bolts, and we should be able to slide this entire tank off of the fuel pump assembly. And then we also need to remove the 2 screws for the fuel level mount as well. And with all of those bolts removed, we should be able to slide this off, like such. So here is the fuel pump housing with the outer surge tank removed, so we can see the single fuel pump that came pre-installed in there. To install the second one, we need to remove the 6AN plug that sits right here in the side of this top sandwich plate. And what I noticed was because I only ordered the 1 single surge pump, I only got 1 of these little 90-degree 6AM fittings, which already came pre-installed in this housing. I don't actually have the second one right now. I don't know if that was an accident or if that was intentional, but I went down to Summit Racing. I took a quick trip down there and was able to get a little 90-degree 6AM fitting that I can install onto the sandwich plate. Now the only problem is with the sandwich plate on here, it keeps knocking into the top hat when I try and secure this fitting. So I'm going to see if I can disassemble this entire thing, remove that sandwich plate, and that should give me a little bit more wiggle room to be able to install this fitting. So I've got the pump housing disassembled, and I apologize because the camera wasn't running. Disassembling this is fairly straightforward. You're just going to have 4 hex bolts that hold this bracket on, 2 on either side. And then the sandwich plate itself is removed by just taking out the 3 hex bolts that hold that in. And now we've got better access to this fitting. So I'm going to try and use one of these 90° 6AN joints in here. I'm going to apply some thread locker, and then we're going to install this so that way we can attach this additional barb fitting, which we're going to use to install our new fuel pump. Alright guys, so I've reinstalled this mounting bracket and reattached it to the top hat. I've gone ahead and test fitted this piece of hose that I'm going to be using for my fuel line. This is one of the submersible plastic ones that I had ordered along with everything else. I've managed to get it over the barb fitting here on the top for that 90° joint. I'm basically going to curl it over, heat this up, and then attach it to the fuel pump here. I've set this fuel pump in about the correct orientation. These fuel filters need to be angled inward. There's a little groove right here which shows where the inlet for the fuel pump should be oriented. So I've kind of got that in approximately the right location. So now I'm going to heat this tube up. We're going to reattach it to our fuel pump, and that'll complete the installation of the additional pump that we're going to use within this housing. And then that's the second fuel pump with the hose securely connected. I've also gone ahead and attached the positive and negative leads for the top hat for these 2 screws. You want to make sure that if you're installing a separate pump to keep in mind which one's positive and negative by looking at the top of the hat here, so that way you don't switch them up. The filter is also installed, so we're pretty much good to go. We're going to slide the tank back onto this housing, and then we're going to go ahead and install the fuel level sensor onto the surge tank.
With the surge tank reassembled, you may want to go around with a multimeter and measure the resistance between each of the pins just to verify that nothing is shorted and that your pumps are hooked up correctly. If you measure across the 2 connections for your fuel pump, you should see a 4 ohm resistance. That's the load of the fuel pump itself. For the fuel level sensor, it depends on how the arm is currently sitting, but it should measure something like 100 ohms. And then measuring between any unrelated connections, you shouldn't see any sort of reading here. This indicates that there's an open between the pins, which means they're not connected. You want to make sure that there's no wires that are shorting them together.
And I apologize for speeding through that, guys. Normally you won't actually have to open up your surge tank. It's just in my case, I only wanted 2 surge pumps, and you don't have an option to do just 2 surge pumps without a lift pump. So I ended up installing my lift pump in here myself. But normally it'll just come with however many pumps you want installed. The only thing you'll need to do is actually put that level sensor on. So I've gone ahead and checked out everything. I've verified that nothing's shorted, as you just saw. I've also gone and labeled, as you can see there, which pump is which. Along with a positive and negative sign. I'll talk to you more about why I labeled the pumps separately in just a second, but we're pretty much good to go. We're going to take this surge pump and we are going to install it back into the car, just as we did with the fuel pump in the fuel pump install video, being careful not to bang the level sensor on anything. We'll go ahead and lower it down into the tank. There is markings on the top hat showing which side should be to the front and which side should be to the rear, so just kind of be mindful of that as you're installing it.
So for the next part, we need to run crossover hoses in between the factory fuel housing location and the surge tank. As I had mentioned previously, the factory fuel housing is now going to be acting as a lift pump to send fuel over to the surge tank and keep it topped off. The radium unit comes with a long section of hose. We need to find the midway point in this and cut it in half. I also highly recommend labeling each of the 2 halves now to ensure that you know which hose is which. I just put a number on it for 1 and 2. That way when we go to hook these hoses up, we make sure to hook them up correctly on both ends. Now we need to get around to actually feeding these hoses down and crossing them over above the fuel tank. You can see there's a little gap here where the light's coming through from the bottom of the car, where there's a gap in between the frame of the vehicle and the gas tank. The radium instructions tell you to try and feed the hose through this little section here, but I found this to be really difficult and had to come up with my own strategy to try and feed these hoses through. This, by the way, is probably arguably the most difficult part of this entire install. It is pretty tricky trying to get these hoses fed up above the fuel tank and to get them to come up through into the car, but with a little bit of persistence and a couple of hours of messing around with it, I was able to get it all worked out.
Alright guys, so I spent a few hours trying to figure out how to get this done. This part is a little bit tricky. Basically, those two hoses that we just cut in half, we need to run crossovers between the driver's side and the passenger side because we're going to be sending fuel from this housing over to the radium unit, and the radium unit is going to be sending fuel back over to the factory fuel hose that sits down here that sends it off to the engine. Again, it took me a while to figure out how to get these hoses up here, but let me get to the bottom side of the car and show you guys what my strategy has been.
So I only took a few photos of this first part, but basically I tried using a snake to feed through the bottom of the car up to the top, and then attempted to tie the fuel hoses to it and then pull it back through. But this really doesn't work too well because the fuel hoses don't flex a ton when they're tied to the snake. What I found works easier is just trying to feed the hoses up through the bottom of the car to begin with. You want to make sure that the hose goes on the inside of the strap for the fuel tank, as well as on the inside of the fuel filler tube that's on the passenger side of the car. It just takes a lot of fiddling around to try and eventually get the hose to feed up correctly here. You can have somebody sitting on the top of the flashlight on the inside of that gap between the tank and the frame to try and find a sort of target to feed the hose up through. And then having somebody there to look for the hose as you begin feeding will also help, because once it's spotted, all you need to do is grab onto it and then pull it back up through the top of the car. Once I had gotten the hoses initially fed up through the passenger side, I needed to try and devise a way to get the hose to slip over the differential and above the tank, and get it to come over to the driver's side so I can do the same thing on the driver's side as well. So this is the tool I'm using for this part to fish the hose over to the driver's side. It is sort of like a plumber snake, except it's just made of a single sort of plate of metal here. It's nice and rigid and allows me to be able to feed this over to the other side and then attach the hose to it. So let me kind of show you guys how that's going to be routed. Alright, so I've got that snake going up above these little breather lines or brake lines here, above the differential, and then comes through on this side where the hose is sitting. Now I've gone ahead and secured it to the hose. It's really important that when you secure this hose down that it's facing the direction that you're planning on pulling it through, otherwise it's going to make it a little bit more complicated. I've just used a couple of zip ties here. This shouldn't pull free of this. Just make sure you have these nice and tight. And we're going to pull it up and route it back over the differential. Keep in mind that you do want your hose to be above that seam in the gas tank, so as you begin pulling this through, try and route your hose above that. Otherwise you can just kind of press it through to get it seated correctly. So yeah, let's go ahead and pull this hose through now. Alright, so we've got the fuel line pulled through now on the driver's side, again going through the inside of that fuel tank strap. Now we're going to route it up in the same direction that that first hose went. You can kind of see that first hose there. There's a little gap in the metal between the tank and the frame, which you can see. That's kind of what you're targeting for. If you manage to push it up in that direction, you should eventually see it pop through on the top side where we now have the radium unit installed. So we're going to go ahead and feed this hose through now and pull it through the top. So now you can see that we have both of the hoses pulled through on the passenger side, feeding all the way through over to the driver's side as well. So now I can begin looking at the new plumbing that we're going to have to put in place to be able to make this whole system work. So let me talk to you now about how the plumbing for this is going to work with the two crossover hoses that are in place. Originally, fuel was pumped through the housing, through the factory fuel line, and out to the engine. But now that we've integrated the surge tank, which needs to be topped off, our fuel pump housing is going to be repurposed to send fuel over to that surge tank. So on the CGM top hat, we're going to be removing the original fitting that's used to connect to the factory line, and we're going to be attaching the 6AN to barbed fitting, which attacks directly to our hose. That's going to send fuel all the way over across to the driver's side, and it's going to the input side of the surge tank, which again we're going to use a little 6AN to barbed fitting adapter. The two fuel pumps in here are going to be able to send fuel out through the output side, again through one of these adapters. This is going to go through our number 2 hose. This is why it was pretty important to label them, is because we want to make sure we don't mix up the ends of the hoses on either side. It'll come back through the number 2 hose, where it's going to intercept this thing here, which is essentially just a check valve and the port. So we've got on here a check valve, which is going to prevent the fuel pressure from bleeding off through our regulator. We've integrated a fuel port as well as a fuel pressure sensor, which is going to go to a fuel pressure gauge, which I'll tell you guys about in a little bit. We've also got one of those barb fittings here to adapt to that fuel hose, as well as that factory style connection so that we can attach it to our original factory fuel line.
where that fuel is going to be able to flow all the way back out through to the engine.
This ocarina-like fitting that looks something straight out of Legend of Zelda simply consists of one of those hose-barbed fittings with a 6AN female side. There is a 6AN male to 8AN male adapter. We've got an 8AN check valve to prevent fuel from flowing back into the car whenever the pumps aren't running. We've got another 8AN male to 6AN male adapter. The port consists of a 6AN female and a 6AN male side, and then we've got that fitting that came with the CJM top hat, which is now being used and repurposed for this fitting. And then we've got a fuel pressure sensor, which is going to be used for a gauge that we'll be installing, but I'll talk about that a little bit later.
Additionally, we are going to be running a piece of airline hosing here from the factory manifold all the way over to the pressure regulator that sits on the surge tank. This setup is a little bit more complicated than most traditional return style fuel systems. Usually what you're going to see is you're just going to have an output and an input fuel line going over to your factory fuel pump housing location, and then that pressure regulator is just going to be sitting within the engine, and it's going to be sending that fuel back over to that fuel pump housing. This setup, again, a little bit more complicated than most that you'll see. The benefit here is just the fact that because we've integrated that surge tank, we aren't going to get issues with fuel starvation whenever we're running low on fuel. So anyways, let's go ahead and get to tightening down each of these fittings. It's fairly straightforward. We just want to make sure we use some PTFE treated sealant on some of our threads so that we don't get any leaks. Tighten everything down. You also might want to use some WD-40 on these hose barbs because they do fit within the hoses pretty snugly. Spray them down really good, get them lubricated, and then they should be able to fit inside these fuel hoses with no problem. So before we begin hooking up all of our fuel lines, we do need to depressurize our system, and I'm still sitting at 40 psi, even though the last time I primed it was a couple of days ago, which is good because it means that I'm holding pressure in the fuel pump as well as the injectors, but it means that fuel is going to spill everywhere if I disconnect a line. Now, I've shown you guys in the past how you can depressurize this by unplugging the fuse for your fuel pump and then just starting the car and letting it die down. Unfortunately, I've got new injectors in the car and haven't gotten tuned yet, so that's not an option right now. So I'm just going to have to surround the fuel damper with towels, undo the screws, kind of let the fuel spill out everywhere, and that'll help depressurize the line, so I won't make as much of a mess when we begin working on it inside of the car.
So I went ahead and swaddled the fuel pressure port and fuel damper in shop towels, and then set about undoing the couple of bolts holding these together until the fuel system ended up pissing itself. Again, I can't emphasize the towels enough here, unless of course you want the entire engine bay covered in fuel. I also went ahead and removed the Z1 fuel access port, which I had originally installed in the fuel pump video. This is just to reduce the clutter in the engine bay and, well, gauges. But once again, I'm getting ahead of myself here.
Alright guys, now I apologize for not filming it all. It's just kind of a complete mess with all the interior torn up right now, and I don't really have a lot of room for the camera. But we've got those fittings in place right now on top of the CGM top hat. You can see right here on the back side, this is the barb fitting that connects to that little swivel 6AN joint. And then that really large fitting that includes the check valve and the port sitting underneath the metal. That's currently connected to the fuel line, the factory fuel line. We've got the wire here for the fuel gauge plugged into that sensor, which is connecting to that fuel port. And then that line is connected and heading all the way over to the driver's side. And then on the driver's side with the surge tank, we have those two barb fittings attached here for the 6AN on the input and the output side. Again, being careful to make sure you attach the right hose to each one. The one for the input side should be leading over to the CGM top hat over there on the passenger side, and the output side should be leading to that large fitting that's heading over to the factory fuel line. We've also got the air hose attached now. This is a 4mm inside diameter, 6mm outside diameter piece of air tubing. I've got it clamped down with a really tiny clamp that's attached to the fitting on the pressure regulator, so that way we've got a nice boost reference. That air line follows all the way around to the edge of the car, goes underneath the door where we've run the wire previously, goes up through that grommet in the engine bay, and then leads over to this hole in the firewall, and then comes out to the engine bay itself, where now we're going to go ahead and attach a T-fitting and then plug it into the manifold. Alright guys, so now we want to look for a nice place to tap into the manifold pressure to be able to get a boost reference. This boost reference is going to be used both for a boost gauge, which we'll install later, as well as for that pressure regulator that sits on top of our surge tank. Now what some people will do is they'll just drill a hole in the manifold and then run their line directly into it and seal it. However, on the 370Z it's a lot easier. Here's our evap purge solenoid right here with the line leading over to the gas tank. And then on this side we have a direct tap over to this manifold. That hose connects directly to this hard line that you can see on the back. And then those lines lead directly to the manifold side of the throttle body. So this gives us a really nice boost reference to tap into. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a T-joint in here, and then we're just going to run our air hose directly to that T-joint, and then it'll give us a nice reference for figuring out what our boost pressure is as the car is running. So we'll go ahead and install that T-joint now. Alright, so here's my plan. This is the hose leading from the purge solenoid over to the manifold. This should be running at the exact same pressure as the manifold itself. And then here is a little 8mm to 4mm T-junction. This should be able to attach inline to our hose like this, and it'll give us a nice 4mm tap to be able to run our air hose over to this T-junction and give us a boost reference. So we're going to go ahead and snip this hose in half, and then we're going to clamp down both sides of that hose onto the 8mm sides, and then we'll go ahead and install this and clamp down the air hose to that 4mm T-junction as well. So I've got that boost reference line in there now. We can see with a couple of hose clamps. These are really tiny 6mm hose clamps. I'll leave a link in the description below to the assortment box that I got these in. But you can see this little piece of electrical tape that I've had to put on there as well because these hose clamps didn't sit tightly on the line. Ideally, your lines should fit on there tightly by themselves and not even need hose clamps. The hose clamps are supposed to be secondary. But you want to make sure you give a firm tug on this line just to make sure that it's not going to slip off as you begin to hit boost, because you really don't want to have a major boost leak like this. So I'm going to reattach this evap hose, and I'm going to end up reassembling the rest of the car, because in the next video we're actually going to be test driving this entire system to make sure that everything is working properly. So I'm going to reinstall the factory air boxes and things that I got and that we took off when we were doing the fuel injectors, and then we'll start working on the wiring. So, to talk about the wiring, the original pump housing that we have is going to have all of the sensors running back to our factory harness. I showed how to do this in the previous pump install video. So we've got those 4 wires normally going back into our harness. We've got the factory pump ground wire that's brought out to our chassis ground, as well as we've grounded the negative terminal of the pump as well. So that way all the current is just going into the chassis and heading to the negative side of the battery. The original power wire for the pump is sent all the way over to a relay. If you guys are just installing a regular fuel return system like what CGM provides, this relay doesn't necessarily need to be in a box or anything. You can kind of just hook it up to any sort of ground source that you have laying around. But that original factory pump signal is sent over to the lift pump relay to act as a trigger to start the relay up. So there's basically a little coil in there, and it's going to switch on power from the battery, which is then sent back to the original pump. The reason why we have to include this relay is these pumps that we're upgrading to draw a lot more current than the factory pumps. We use like a 25 amp fuse to be able to power each of these, so we need a larger gauge wire to be able to power it. I do talk about this a little bit in the pump install video, so I recommend watching that if you have any more questions on how to wire the pump up. Now, because we're installing the surge tank system, we have some additional wiring for the 2 pumps that are going to go into that surge tank. The level sensor, the 2 wires are going to come out and connect to the factory harness as normal. There are going to be 2 negative terminals, one for each of those pumps. They're going to connect to a common ground source to allow current to flow back to the negative terminal of the battery. So we're going to connect this anywhere on the chassis that we can find. And then we have 2 additional power wires that are going to go to the relays for surge pump 1 and surge pump 2. Now, I've decided that I want to install a switch in line with that second pump, because normally for my setup, 2 pumps isn't going to be completely necessary. It's going to be more so important when I begin switching over to E85 and we need a lot more flow, that I may need to be able to use this additional pump. So I don't necessarily want it to be running constantly because of the fact that the original fuel pump location is sending fuel back over to our sending unit over to the surge tank on the driver's side. This fuel is a lot more filtered than what these pumps are going to be picking up. Basically, if I have both of these pumps turned on, that check valve that sits on the bottom of the surge tank is going to have to pull some fuel up through the bottom of it, and that fuel is not going to be as filtered as the fuel that's coming from the original factory pump with that fuel filter that's kind of integrated into that original housing. Basically, I just want to limit the amount of flow so that all that fuel is coming over from our original filter. That way the fuel's a lot cleaner, there's a lot less risk of getting the injectors all clogged up. So I want to have the option to be able to turn this on and off if needed. Maybe I'll be running E85 in the future. There's also the option of potentially wiring this in as a boost level switch. This is something that Eugene had talked with me about. You can wire in your boost reference so that when you hit a certain amount of boost, be it 9, 10, 11 psi, whatever it is, you can actually switch on this pump and then have it run as well in tangent with your first pump. So because of the fact that I have 3 relays here, it becomes convenient to try and organize this in one easy to access location where you can maintenance everything. The relay box that I have here was a suggestion that was given to me by Eugene. I'll leave a link again in the description below showing where you can get this. But the idea is that you can just stick these 6 relays all in one location. I've got 3 spares now in case I want to add in some additional power electronics, whether it be something related to the sound system or maybe an aftermarket horn. I've got these 3 additional relays which are just there in case I need them. This relay box houses the fuses and everything as well, which is really convenient because again, you can just access each of those fuses and find them all in one spot. This relay box attaches nicely to the back of the ECU and it actually fits quite snugly up underneath the passenger footwell behind that ECU plate. To get to this, all you have to do is undo 2 bolts and undo the ECU connectors and it drops down really easy for you to be able to wire in any additional devices. This relay box has each of the power wires from each of those relays going to one larger 4-gauge wire, and that 4-gauge wire just runs all the way up to the battery. And then the negative terminals from each of these relays are just going to be connected to a common ground, which I've attached to the back of the ECU plate because the ECU plate has a really nice ground connection via the 2 mounting bolts that it has. So that explains pretty much all the wiring for the relay box as well as the fuel pumps. Additionally, in this video, I am going to be installing a couple of gauges. Namely, I'm going to be installing a boost gauge as well as a fuel pressure gauge. Now, I did already install a fuel pressure gauge in a previous video. I used a fuel access port which sits underneath the damper, and that allowed me to check on the fuel pump and make sure that the pressure was looking okay. However, as we're beginning to tune this car and after we've installed the supercharger, it's going to be nice to be able to see that reading while I'm actually inside the cabin. So I've decided to install a digital pressure gauge, which uses that access port on that fuel fitting, which is connected to the factory line that I showed you earlier. That just plugs in there and then connects back to that gauge, which I can monitor inside the car so we can make sure that we're getting a 1-to-1 increase with fuel pressure. I'm also installing that boost gauge. For that, we're just going to attach a pressure sensor to that air line that we are running for the boost reference for the fuel pressure regulator. The wiring for this is fairly straightforward. After we've plugged both of those connectors into the gauges, we're also going to be installing a wire for power to our battery, as well as a grounding wire, so that's straightforward. There's also going to be a line for the accessory on signal, so we're just going to find one of the accessory on wires, tap into it, run it to our gauges. And then there's also going to be a separate line for the headlights, which because they dim depending on if the headlights are on, we're going to need to run an additional wire for that. Again, don't be intimidated by this wiring, guys. I am going to try and show you what it looks like after I've got everything wired up. Unfortunately, it is going to be pretty cramped in there, and the entire interior of the Z is kind of a mess right now. So I am probably going to fast forward it. Once I've got all the wiring in place, I'm going to show you guys what it looks like. Also, feel free again to ask me questions on Instagram because I do know that this can be a bit complicated sometimes to understand. Feel free to pause the video and take a look at this wiring diagram. Let's get to it. Alright, so I've got all the wiring done according to the diagram that I just showed you guys earlier. One quick note is on these wires from the factory harness that lead to the fuel level sensor, the polarity here doesn't matter because the fuel level sensor itself is just a potentiometer. It's just going to vary in resistance with the fuel level. So it doesn't matter which order you plug these in for that fuel level itself. So yeah, it's kind of a mess back here right now. I've got wires going everywhere, especially from the subwoofer and everything. But everything's pretty much in place. I've got the grounding wire here in the same location I used for the ground for my amplifier. I've got those 2 power wires in blue here for the fuel pumps, and I've labeled them separately 1 and 2 so I know which one's which, so I've kind of marked them in Sharpie on this end. Those power wires are running underneath the center console. For the second fuel pump, I have it plugged into this switch here, so that way I can turn it on and off as needed. And I've just got them currently pulled out of here right now. Eventually I'm going to route them behind the dash and then over to where that relay box is. But first I'm going to go ahead and clean up the interior because it's just a mess back here. Kind of want to get things a little bit more cleaned up, and then we'll go ahead and work on wiring everything into our relays and installing our gauges. Alright, so I've got the entire rear of the car reassembled now. What we're going to do is we're going to take out our glove box to be able to get to the ECU so that we can access our relay box and start wiring in everything.
So for this glove box, all you need to do to remove it, there's 4 screws that are going to be sitting up here at the top. There's also going to be one over here to the side. I don't know if you can see it with the light, but you're going to have one on either side that you'll need to undo. And then there's also one way up in there that you need to use a long neck screwdriver for. I've already taken this out before and I only put a couple of screws back in. But yeah, we're going to go ahead and get this glove box removed, and then I can show you guys the ECU and where we're mounting the relay box for all of this. So this right here is our ECU. It's held up by a 10mm bolt up top, and there's another one that sits way back in there near the firewall. We undo both of those, and then there are these little connectors here that we have to basically press in that tab, pull this all the way up, and then we can pop these out. So there's a total of 3 of them. We need to remove those, and then we can pull the ECU down and then reveal our relay box, which is going to be sitting at the back. So here is the relay box in question. It's really convenient for being able to store 6 relays as well as their individual different fuses here. For power, I've basically got all of the power wires from each of these relays routed up through a single piece of 4-gauge wire, and that goes directly to the battery. And then for the grounding cable, again, another piece of 4-gauge wire, which is just attached directly to the frame. So I've got an image showing kind of what the wiring looks like on the back of this. Basically just got to wire out each of these relays. It does take quite a little bit of time, but it just gives you a nice convenient place to be able to add on any additional power electronics or things that you're going to need pretty quickly, because you just got to plug in. So what we need to do for this, since we're going to be adding these 2 additional pumps, I've already got the sense wire, or the trigger wire, for that first pump. This wire basically comes from the fuel pump from the original factory housing. We're basically using that as a trigger to turn on the original pump that we had. But since we're using that as a lift pump and we have 2 additional pumps we need to turn on, I'm basically just going to tap into this wire, and we're going to send that to the other 2 trigger signals here for relays 2 and 3. And then we're going to be sending power to that out on this end using the power wires coming from each of those relays to the device. For that, we're going to need to send each of these 2 wires around. We've currently only got them coming through here where the shifter is. We need to send them through the back. So in order to do that, we're going to have to take apart this section of the paneling and then see if we can feed the wires up through here, so that way we can connect them over to our relay box. Alright, so we've got the 3 power wires plugged in now, the 2 additional ones coming from the 2 fuel pumps for the surge tank. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and tap into this wire to use as the trigger for those other 2 pumps as well. Basically, we're just going to be fanning this wire out to connect to these other 2 relays. So the ECU is back in place, the relay box sitting on the back of it. I'll try and get a better picture of it for you with the lighting here. But we've got those 2 additional wires going to our new fuel pumps. We'll tuck this wiring away up in a second. We fanned out the trigger wire here to be able to go to all 3 of those relays. So that's pretty much set. Again, we'll clean up the wiring in a second. Now we're going to get to starting to do the gauges. So one thing I did off camera, this right here is the actual boost pressure sensor that comes with my boost gauge. It's a little black box which I've gone ahead and attached to a bolt sitting back here. We've got the cable running away from this, which is going to attach to the gauge itself. This right here is a little T-joint essentially that came with this air hose fitting. It's basically a push connector where each of these airline hoses just kind of pushes in here, and this is the hose actually leading to the manifold. And this is the hose leading over to our fuel pressure regulator, and then I've just got that additional tap here to be able to use this as my boost as well for the gauge. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to bring the glove box over. We're actually going to be installing the sensors itself within the glove box. Alright
guys, so I want to explain to you what my wiring is like now that I've got the tablet removed. So this right here is the factory harness that goes to the stereo. I ended up buying a little adapter here that basically just splays out each of those wires so that you can solder into them accordingly. I've just kind of put little bits of electrical tape over the unused wires that I had. For this, I ended up using this accessory wire here, which comes out as red from this little adapter. On the back side, it's actually that blue wire there. I'm actually going to leave a little diagram on here kind of showing where each of these wires are in this harness. But yeah, so basically that accessory wire is currently coming out right now. So I need to make use of a couple of additional wires. So for these gauges that we're going to be installing, sorry, it's kind of a mess down here. For these gauges that we're going to be installing, we've basically got two plugs for each gauge. So again, I'm getting a fuel pressure gauge and a boost gauge. We're going to have the single plug here, which comes from each of the sensors, one from that fuel pressure sensor coming out from the passenger side, one from that boost gauge, which I already showed you down there, that pressure sensor. So yeah, that sensor is going to plug into that middle plug with the 3 prongs, and this one on the bottom is a 4 prong. So what I've got up here are those 2 plugs, one for each of the gauges, and then those aren't long enough by themselves. They don't really go very far, so I ended up adding a extension to it by just soldering in some additional wire, and again, it kind of looks like a bit of a mess right here, but all I've really done is just kind of extended the wires to make them reach out a little bit longer and added a few extra strands because I just had some thin gauge going here. So what each of these 4 wires are, and you should read the manual for your gauges to kind of figure out the coloring, but this black wire here we're going to just send to ground source. We've got a red wire here, which is going to be our accessory power source. We have a white wire, which is going to act as our constant 12-volt source. That way, any internal memory within these gauges, like including the color and things, will stay. And then we've got a little green wire here, which is going to attach to our headlights to allow for dimming whenever the headlights are turned on. So we need to attach each of these 4 wires. Ground is pretty easy. I mean, I've already got a ground wire here, which I've taken the electrical tape off of, so we can just solder into that. I've already got that accessory on wire, which was plugged into that hub, so I'm just going to solder into that wire as well. This orange wire here, which is actually, I believe, red on the back plug. Yeah, it's going to be that red wire there. That wire is actually the illumination wire. This goes high whenever you turn your headlights on. I actually went and checked this with a multimeter. So I'm going to solder into this to be able to allow the gauges to dim. And then we are going to use this yellow wire for our constant voltage source. That yellow wire is also yellow on the back side as well. Again, double check the wiring diagram. It's available in the AV section of the factory service manual, but again, I'm also leaving a diagram kind of showing where some of these important wires are that you're going to need to know for these gauges. So again, it's really easy for me just because all the wires are coming out since I've got this harness. But if you have the factory stereo, you're probably going to have to tap into the back of these wires, so just be careful as you're doing that. You're not going to be able to cut them. You're going to end up having to use some sort of wire tap. But anyways, because I've got that tablet and because I've already got that connection coming out, I'm just going to solder into each of these wires and make my connections. Alright, so now I've got both pairs of wires for both of the gauges coming through the glove box now. One for the fuel pressure gauge, one for the boost gauge. And some of you may be saying that this is not the sexiest place that you could put your gauges, and I would completely agree with you. This is only a temporary solution right now. I've gone and bought some little $10 pods that I'm just going to be sticking inside of here temporarily while the car is getting tuned. Come about October or so, I do have a much nicer location that I'm going to be placing these in. I've got something being currently made for the car right now. Super excited about that, but we'll talk about that more in a different video. For now, I'm just going to be temporarily storing them in here. So what we're going to be doing is we're just going to be taking each of our gauges, putting them inside these little pods, which I've drilled a hole in to be able to run the wires through. They also come with, if I can find them, little adhesive pads that are going to go on the bottom of each of these little gauges, and they're just going to sit inside this glove box for now. So yeah, let me go ahead and wire up the gauges, then I'm just going to clean up the wiring down in the footwell, reattach the glove box, and then we can start to prime our pump and see how our fuel pressure is looking. Alright, so we've currently got the car in accessory on mode, so the tablet's on and everything, but the amplifier and the fuel pumps are not primed yet. We can see that the gauges are turning on. These gauges are really nice, by the way, because you can actually go through and cycle to different colors. I apologize if on camera it's not coming off as very in focus. I found that the camera's having a hard time actually focusing on this. But the boost gauge is reading -1, which is interesting to see. It should technically be reading 0 because it should be at atmosphere in the manifold right now because the car's not running. But I'm not too concerned about that. But what we will want to check now is our fuel pressure, because for the first time we're going to go ahead and prime the pumps. Now when you're priming your pumps after installing your new fuel pumps and everything, you're going to need to prime it a few times to actually get this value to go up. Hopefully there's no electrical shorts, hopefully everything's going to be fine. We're going to try and get that pressure up to maybe about 45 psi at least. And then later we're going to be able to start the car, and then we can fine tune it even more to get to the factory 52 psi that we want. So we're going to go ahead and prime the pump a couple of times and try and see what our pressure gets up to. Alright guys, here we go, priming up the radium system for the first time. Alright, so I actually heard the pumps firing up. That's a good sign. We're still sitting at 0 psi over on the gauges, so we're going to continue to prime it a couple of times here until we can finally get some pressure readings over on those gauges. So we got 11 psi now, so we're starting to climb up a little bit. We're going to prime the pumps again, see what we can get out of it. Alright, pulled it up to 37. One thing to note, by the way, you want to keep an eye on that pressure. See how quickly it drops. You want to make sure that you don't really have any leaks, and now is also a good time to go and inspect your hoses to make sure that you're not bleeding any fuel out of the system that way. It looks like it's holding fairly stable. It's not dropping nearly as quickly as it used to. I did see it drop about a psi when we first primed it, but it seems to be holding at 36, so that's a good indicator. So let's go ahead and prime it again, see if we can get it even higher up, and see what it levels off at. Alright, so I've got a feeling it's going to top off at 42 psi. It didn't jump a whole lot more. We're going to prime it one more time and see where it goes. As you can see there, it did just drop another psi. It's possible that that may be just hysteresis with the pressure sensor. It might read slightly high initially. But I'm going to keep an eye on this after we've got it primed, and we're going to see how quickly it falls, just to make sure that it's holding pressure. Alright, so I didn't really gain any additional pressure after priming the pump that fourth time. So it's leveled off at 42. I'm actually going to drive the pressure up a little bit higher. So on the top of that fuel pressure regulator, there's a nut, and you can turn that nut to try and increase the fuel pressure a little bit from the regulator.
I was actually mistaken about how this works initially. The nut on the bottom is actually just a locking nut to hold the fuel pressure steady and keep the threads in place. In order to adjust the fuel pressure, you actually need to loosen that nut, and then you need to drive the thread in the center using a really tiny Allen hex head. And then once you have your fuel pressure set correctly, you need to retighten that nut down to be able to get the pressure to remain steady at wherever it is you intend to put it.
And that's going to be it for this video, guys. I want to apologize for how long it's taken to get this one out. Unfortunately, installing the return style fuel system has just been such an involved process. It took me at least a couple of weeks. There's also just been a couple of delays, whether it be waiting on parts or other things. But everything's in now. I also apologize if towards the end of that video it seemed like I was kind of rushing through the explanation, especially for the wiring. It was so difficult to film inside the car with everything being as cramped as it was, and it was also getting extremely hot. It was like 106 out. So I was just kind of struggling to be able to keep pushing and doing the DIY process and documenting everything. But you guys can always reach out to me on Instagram at @TheHorizon, and I'll try and answer any questions that you guys have. So the plan moving forward with this build originally was to install the supercharger right after I got the return style fuel system in. However, Precision Turbo, who manufactures the 50mm blow-off valve, which I'm going to be installing with Aaron's kit, hasn't shipped the blow-off valve yet. They were supposed to ship it a couple of weeks ago, but now we currently have no estimated ship date. I'm working with Aaron right now to figure out what my options are. But in the meantime, the car has actually been tuned. I was working with Eugene Turkov a few days ago, and we actually got a ROM flashed on the car so I can actually drive the vehicle around with the upgraded fuel injectors as well as the return style fuel system. So before the supercharger install, I'll probably do a video on how to install the Ecotech software, how to flash ROMs to the vehicle, how to data log, and also how to look at the data that you actually collect to see if there's anything off with the vehicle to make sure it's actually working well. Everything on my car is actually working perfectly so far, it looks like, apart from a small exhaust leak, but we'll talk to you about that in the next video. But yeah, the car's been running well for about a week now. So as I said, I'll probably do that video on the Ecutech software. But even before that, in case you guys haven't been following the news on the 400Z from Nissan, the digital unveil of the concept art is supposed to happen on September 16th. So I'm probably going to do a reaction video to that when the digital concept is released. They've been releasing a lot of great information, including just today they announced that there will be a manual option for the 400Z, which I'm super excited about. But we'll talk more about that in the next video. I want to thank you guys for watching once again. Like and subscribe if you're not already a subscriber so you can follow this build. I'll be doing a complete DIY on the Supercharger install. Thank you guys once again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Later.